My fiancée's phone died, so I tracked her using Find My Device. It led me to a backyard party, where she was dancing on a pole in a bikini while two guys held her waist. When she noticed me, and we made eye contact, the night started ordinary enough that it barely registered as a memory worth keeping. I was at home, shoes kicked off near the door, scrolling through unread emails and half listening to the television. Isolde had gone out earlier, saying she needed air after a long week, saying she would be back late, saying nothing that raised suspicion because nothing about her tone sounded off. We had been together long enough that routine explanations stopped sounding like excuses. Around 10, I noticed the silence. No updates. No casual message. No photo sent without context the way she sometimes did when she was bored. I told myself her phone battery probably dipped low, because she always forgot to charge it, because it had happened before, because trusting someone you planned to marry meant resisting the instinct to invent danger where none existed. By 11, the silence felt heavier. I tried calling. Straight to voicemail. I waited a few minutes and tried again. Same result. I paced the apartment, moving things that did not need moving, checking the front door as if she might materialize just because I looked. I opened our shared location app more out of habit than panic, fully expecting it to show her phone last pinging near downtown bars or at Lisa's place. Instead, the map showed a dot blinking in a residential pocket on the far edge of the city. It took a moment for my brain to accept what my eyes were seeing. The address meant nothing to me. It was not near any place she mentioned. It was not a commercial zone. It was not somewhere you ended up accidentally after midnight. I refreshed the app. The dot stayed. I grabbed my keys and left without overthinking it, telling myself I was being cautious, telling myself I would laugh about it later, telling myself that concern was not the same thing as control. The drive felt longer than it should have, even though the roads were clear. With every mile, the idea that this was a misunderstanding became harder to hold on to. When I turned onto the street, the noise hit first. Music rolled over the houses in heavy waves, bass vibrating through closed windows, laughter breaking through between beats. Cars lined both sides of the road, packed so tight, it looked like a block party that never asked for permission. Colored lights flickered above fences. Shadows moved where they should not have been visible. I parked half a block away and walked, my steps slowing as the address numbers matched the screen on my phone. The house itself was unremarkable from the front, a plain structure with dark windows and a side gate slightly ajar. The sound poured from behind it, loud and reckless, the kind of noise that dared neighbors to complain. I stood there longer than I should have, telling myself this was still nothing, telling myself I was about to feel foolish, telling myself that love meant giving explanations a chance to exist. Then someone stumbled out the gate laughing, barely noticing me as they rejoined a group on the sidewalk, and I saw enough skin and glitter to understand this was not a casual gathering. I followed the sound through the gate. The backyard was chaos shaped into celebration. Strings of lights hung unevenly between trees. A temporary bar leaned against the fence. People filled every corner, moving, drinking, shouting over music that was far too loud for the space. In the center stood a metal pole anchored to a wooden platform, surrounded by bodies pressed close together. It took my eyes too long to find her, and somehow that made it worse. Isolde was elevated above the crowd, barefoot on the platform, wearing a bikini that did not belong to any version of her life I knew. Her hair was loose, her movements practiced, confident, deliberate. Two men stood behind her, hands firm on her waist as she leaned back, her body arching with the rhythm. They were not guiding her away. They were anchoring her there. Time compressed into something sharp and unbearable. I felt heat rush up my neck, felt my stomach hollow out, felt the kind of disorientation that makes balance unreliable. My brain tried to catalog details the way it does in emergencies, because that is easier than processing emotion. I noticed the way people cheered. I noticed phones raised, recording. I noticed how comfortable she looked. Then she turned her head. Our eyes met. The moment stretched far beyond what logic allowed. Her expression shifted, not into guilt, not into fear, but into something closer to calculation. The men behind her noticed the change before I moved, their hands tightening instinctively, as if they sensed tension before understanding its source. Music kept playing. The crowd kept moving. The world did not stop just because mine had. I stepped forward. People parted without knowing why, responding to the pressure of my movement more than intent. Someone brushed my arm and apologized without looking. I did not slow down. I did not shout. I did not need to. My presence alone was enough to fracture the scene. Isolde stepped down from the platform, landing lightly, her eyes never leaving mine. The men released her, exchanging confused looks, already distracted by someone else calling them over. She took 2 steps toward me, then stopped, as if measuring distance the way people do when deciding whether to lie or deflect. Around us, the party adjusted, attention flickering between curiosity and entertainment. I saw Damon near the bar, his face tightening as recognition set in. I saw Lisa frozen near the fence, drink halfway to her mouth, realizing too late that secrets decay faster in crowds. I asked her what this was without raising my voice, without forcing drama into the air. The words felt heavy leaving my mouth, because asking meant acknowledging that what I was seeing was real. She responded quickly, too quickly, gestures broad, explanations forming before the question fully landed. She talked about fun, about harmlessness, about misunderstandings, about context that apparently required half-naked dancing and strangers holding her steady. The explanations did not match the environment. They floated, disconnected, desperate to be believed without earning it. I noticed how many people were watching now. I noticed phones lowering, curiosity satisfied, drama already moving to the next focal point. I noticed how comfortable she was speaking in this setting, how little she seemed affected by the audience. That realization hurt more than the dancing itself. I told her we were leaving. The statement was calm, practical, the way one addresses a situation that has already crossed into unacceptable territory. She did not agree. She said we would talk later, said she needed space, said she was not finished. Finished with what was never clarified. Behind her, someone restarted cheering near the pole, momentum returning as if nothing meaningful had been interrupted. The party swallowed the moment, and that was when I understood this place was not an accident. This was a routine. This was familiar ground. A man I did not know stepped between us briefly, smiling too widely, telling me to relax, telling me it was all in good fun. His hand brushed Isolde's shoulder with familiarity that made my jaw tighten. She did not move away. I left before the situation forced me to become someone I did not want to be. I walked back through the gate, the music chasing me down the street, my hands shaking despite my effort to steady them. I sat in my car for several minutes before turning the key, staring at the address on my phone as if it might rearrange itself into something reasonable. On the drive home, my thoughts refused to stay linear. Images replayed without permission. Details sharpened instead of fading. I realized I had never been told about this group, these parties, this side of her life that required secrecy to exist. I realized how easily she moved in that environment, how little hesitation she showed when confronted. By the time I reached the apartment, my shock had evolved into something colder and more deliberate. I opened drawers and cabinets, not to pack, but to look. I checked accounts we shared. I reviewed transactions I had ignored because trust makes oversight feel unnecessary. Patterns emerged quickly once I allowed myself to see them. Charges tied to event equipment. Transfers that did not align with our expenses. Withdrawals timed around weekends she claimed were quiet. The realization landed without drama, but with weight. The party was not just a betrayal of intimacy. It was a misuse of shared resources, a deception layered with planning. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages stacked up without being opened. Missed calls followed. I turned the phone face down and sat at the table, letting the silence settle in the apartment she had not returned to. What I had seen in that backyard was only the visible surface of something larger. The ease with which she stood there, the lack of shame when discovered, the immediate pivot to justification instead of explanation, all pointed to a truth that refused to be minimized. That night did not end with closure or confrontation. It ended with understanding, and that understanding made sleep impossible. By morning, I knew this was not about forgiveness or argument. It was about uncovering how far this had already gone, who else was involved, and what consequences were already in motion long before I walked through that gate. The party had been loud, public, undeniable. What came next would be quieter, more damaging, and impossible to dance away. Morning arrived without clarity. The apartment felt altered, not by missing objects but by the absence of assumptions I had relied on without noticing. Isolde still had not returned. Her silence no longer read as avoidance, but as confidence, the kind that comes from believing a situation can be managed once emotions cool. I did not allow myself that luxury. I sat at the table with a legal pad and rewound the last 6 months of our lives, not sentimentally, but structurally, looking for patterns instead of moments. The first pattern was time. Weekends that had been labeled as spontaneous plans or overdue self-care aligned almost perfectly with the transactions I saw the night before. Charges repeated themselves in variations that made sense only when grouped together. Lighting rentals, portable sound equipment, cash withdrawals timed within hours of each other. None of it was catastrophic alone. Together, it described a system. I went to work late on purpose. I needed the drive to think, needed the normalcy of traffic and radio chatter to keep my reactions proportional. Halfway there, a message came through from Damon. He did not ask how I was. He asked if we could talk, framing it like damage control instead of concern. I told him to meet me after work, choosing a place far from our usual orbit. At the office, I learned that rumors travel faster when they have visuals. Someone had already seen a clip. Someone else had been sent a screenshot. No one confronted me directly, but conversations thinned when I entered rooms. It was not pity I sensed. It was fascination, the kind that feeds on the collapse of something that looked stable from the outside. By lunchtime, Isolde finally reached out. Her message avoided specifics, leaning on language that suggested misunderstanding rather than explanation. She asked when I would be home, not whether she could come back. The phrasing mattered. I did not respond. I spent my break contacting our landlord, asking questions that sounded hypothetical but were not. I confirmed notice requirements. I confirmed what happened if one tenant vacated early. The answers were neutral, procedural, uninvested in drama. I appreciated that. After work, I met Damon at a bar that smelled like disinfectant and regret. He arrived early and sat stiffly, his posture rehearsed. He began speaking before I could order, explaining without context, apologizing without admitting anything concrete. I listened without interrupting, letting him talk long enough to reveal what mattered. He admitted the parties had been going on for over a year. He admitted they rotated locations to avoid attention. He admitted Isolde was not a guest but a fixture. When he said that word, something settled into place. He spoke about the pole like it was furniture. He spoke about the men like they were volunteers. He spoke about the money like it was pooled, temporary, replaceable. When I asked how many people knew she was engaged, he hesitated. That pause answered the question better than words. Damon said something then that shifted the ground beneath the conversation. He said the parties were invite-only, curated, designed to blur lines without crossing them publicly. He said boundaries were part of the appeal. He said the risk was the point. I realized then that what I saw was not a loss of control. It was performance. I left before the drink arrived. On the way home, I received a message from Lisa, longer than Isolde's, more precise. She claimed she wanted to help. She asked if I had seen the group chat. I asked her to send it. She did not immediately. When she did, it was partial, cropped, selective. Even filtered, it revealed enough. Isolde had not hidden her engagement. She had framed it. She described it as stability. She described me as reliable. She described the parties as release. She talked about balancing worlds like it was a skill set. The messages were not cruel. They were dismissive, which somehow felt worse. I noticed dates attached to messages. I noticed references to my schedule. I noticed jokes about how predictable I was, how easy it was to plan around me. The realization did not spark anger. It sparked embarrassment, the private kind that lingers. When Isolde finally returned that evening, she did not knock. She walked in like nothing had shifted, like continuity could be asserted by posture alone. She spoke immediately, trying to reclaim narrative momentum. She talked about expression. She talked about independence. She talked about trust as if it were something she was owed rather than something she had fractured. I asked her to sit down. She did not. She hovered, pacing, controlling the space through movement. When I asked about the money, she paused for the first time since entering. Not long, but long enough. She admitted using our shared account. She framed it as temporary borrowing. She framed it as investment. She framed it as harmless because nothing bad had happened yet. The word yet hung between us, unintended but accurate. I told her the lease situation. I told her the account was being separated. I told her she would need to make arrangements. The conversation shifted tone immediately. The confidence drained. The performance cracked. She accused me of overreacting. She accused me of controlling behavior. She accused me of threatening her independence. When she realized I was not engaging emotionally, her strategy changed again. She offered compromise. She suggested counseling. She suggested boundaries. She suggested transparency starting now, as if timing could retroactively justify behavior. I did not respond to the suggestions. I asked one question instead, the only one that mattered. I asked how many people from her professional life attended those parties. Her silence confirmed what her words could not undo. Over the next few days, consequences began moving without my direct involvement. Someone forwarded a clip to someone else's supervisor. Someone recognized someone they should not have. Attendance dropped. Messages grew cautious. The group chat went quiet. Isolde oscillated between panic and denial. She slept on the couch when she slept at all. She made calls in the bathroom. She stopped using her card. She asked if I had talked to anyone. I told her nothing, which was true. The third shock arrived not through confrontation, but through mail. A notice from our bank flagged irregular activity, pending review. The amount was not enormous. The implication was, shared funds used for unreported income streams triggered scrutiny neither of us had anticipated. That night, Isolde cried, not out of remorse but out of fear. The distinction mattered. She asked what would happen. I told her I did not know. That answer frightened her more than accusation. By the end of the week, the parties had stopped. The silence that replaced them was louder than the music ever was. What had seemed like a private world revealed itself to be fragile, dependent on secrecy and borrowed stability. I understood then that the backyard party had not been the betrayal. It had been the reveal. Everything after it was consequence unfolding at its own pace, indifferent to apologies. The situation was no longer contained to our relationship. It had expanded into finances, employment, and reputations that could not be controlled once exposed. What began as spectacle was becoming liability, and it was clear that whatever came next would not be handled in crowds or under lights. It would happen quietly, through offices, documents, and decisions that could not be undone with explanation. The collapse did not arrive with shouting or dramatic exits. It arrived through process, forms, notifications, meetings scheduled with neutral language that concealed consequences behind politeness. By the start of the second week, the apartment had become a shared waiting room, occupied by two people preparing for different futures under the same roof. I moved my remaining money into an account with my name alone. I changed passwords that had been shared out of convenience. I cataloged documents that mattered and placed them in a folder that did not leave my sight. None of it felt retaliatory. It felt preventative, the way you board up windows before a storm rather than after. Isolde's phone never stopped buzzing. She began answering calls in fragments, pacing, lowering her voice, stepping onto the balcony even when the weather did not justify it. I heard the same phrases repeated with small variations, explanations reshaped for different audiences. She spoke about misunderstandings. She spoke about exaggerated perceptions. She spoke about people overreacting. One afternoon, she returned earlier than expected, her movements sharper, less controlled. She dropped her bag by the door and stood there, breathing unevenly, as if the apartment itself might reject her presence. She said her supervisor wanted to speak with her again, this time with someone from compliance present. She said they asked about outside income. She said they asked about images. The word images changed the temperature of the room, not because of embarrassment, but because of permanence. Images do not retract once shared. They do not soften with time. They circulate until they find the wrong desk. She said someone had recognized her at the party, someone who had not been invited, someone who did not understand the boundaries she believed protected her. She said the clip had traveled farther than expected. She said she was being asked to provide explanations she did not have. I asked if she had disclosed any of this when she was hired. She did not answer directly. She said her work had nothing to do with her private life. She said she was being judged unfairly. She said people were pretending to care about ethics when they really cared about appearances. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because interruption would have implied debate. There was nothing left to debate. 2 days later, a letter arrived addressed to both of us. It was not dramatic. It was informational. The bank required clarification regarding a series of transactions tied to unregistered events and potential income reporting discrepancies. The letter did not accuse. It outlined next steps. Isolde read it twice before sitting down. She asked if this would affect me. I told her it might. That was the first time she seemed to understand that the damage extended beyond her. That evening, Damon reached out again. His tone had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by urgency. He asked if I had spoken to anyone official. He asked if I knew what people were saying. He asked if I understood the implications. I told him I understood consequences better than implications. He admitted then that the parties were more than social. They collected entrance fees disguised as donations. They paid performers under the table. They rotated hosts to avoid patterns. He said it had worked until it had not. He said Isolde was not the organizer, but she was visible, and visibility carried risk. When I asked why she continued after getting engaged, he paused. He said she liked the separation. He said she liked having a version of herself untouched by responsibility. He said she believed she could compartmentalize indefinitely. The next shock did not come from law enforcement or employers. It came from the landlord. A complaint had been filed regarding unregistered commercial activity linked to our address. The complaint was incorrect in location but accurate in association. Our names were now adjacent to words that invited scrutiny. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer recommended by a colleague who specialized in untangling shared exposure. The consultation was clinical. The advice was clear. Separate everything. Document everything. Do not assume intent matters as much as record. When I returned home, I told Isolde I had spoken to legal counsel. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She accused me of escalation. She accused me of betrayal. She accused me of preparing for war instead of resolution. I told her preparation was not hostility. I told her that ignorance would not protect either of us. I told her that silence had already cost more than honesty ever would have. She broke then, not theatrically, but inwardly. She sat on the floor, back against the couch, hands folded in her lap, as if holding something fragile. She admitted she had underestimated how fragile the system was. She admitted she believed consequences only applied when mistakes were made, not when lines were intentionally blurred. Over the next few days, she moved between temporary fixes and long-term fear. She drafted emails she never sent. She deleted photos she could not erase from other people's devices. She rehearsed explanations that sounded hollow even to her. Her workplace placed her on administrative leave pending review. The language was careful. The implication was not. She spent hours refreshing her inbox, waiting for clarity that would not arrive quickly. Meanwhile, my own professional life shifted subtly. A meeting request appeared on my calendar from Human Resources, framed as routine. It was not. They asked whether I had any external business interests that could intersect with my role. They asked whether I had knowledge of activities that might reflect poorly on the company if publicized. I answered honestly. I disclosed what I knew and when I learned it. The difference between our situations was not morality. It was timing. I had walked into the truth unexpectedly. She had curated it. The review concluded without action on my end. It did not conclude for her. By the end of the month, the shared account was closed. The lease termination was scheduled. The apartment emptied in stages, her belongings moving out faster than mine, as if distance could be measured in boxes. The third major realization arrived quietly, late one night, while I reviewed documents alone. The parties had not just risked reputation or income. They had risked consent and liability. People had been recorded without permission. Money had changed hands without oversight. One complaint was enough to unravel everything. I understood then that what I had seen in that backyard was the most harmless version of what could have gone wrong. The spectacle had distracted from the structure beneath it. Isolde left for the last time on a Tuesday morning, carrying what remained of her certainty with her. She did not ask where I stood anymore. She asked what would happen next. I told her that next was not something either of us controlled anymore. The door closed without finality, because finality belongs to outcomes, not moments. What followed would be determined by offices, reviews, and decisions made by people who had never heard the music, never seen the lights, and would not care why anyone thought it was harmless. The party had ended weeks ago. The consequences were only beginning to show their shape. The final phase did not announce itself. There was no single call, no dramatic letter, no moment that felt like a climax while it was happening. It unfolded through confirmations, deadlines, and outcomes delivered with professional calm. The kind of calm that does not care how loud the music once was. By the time Isolde's administrative leave turned into termination, the apartment was already empty. The lease ended without penalties because documentation mattered more than stories. I handed in keys on a Thursday morning and walked out without looking back, not because of resolve, but because there was nothing left inside that belonged to me. Places lose their gravity once the narrative attached to them dissolves. Isolde's job cited reputational risk and failure to disclose external income-generating activities. The phrasing was careful. The decision was final. Appeals were technically allowed, but practically futile. Her industry thrived on perception, and perception had already formed without her input. No amount of explanation could compete with images circulating without context or mercy. The bank review concluded shortly after. I was cleared of wrongdoing based on timing, cooperation, and documentation. The shared account was flagged, but closed without further action against me. Isolde's name did not exit the process as cleanly. She was required to provide additional records, additional explanations, additional proof that she did not have. The review did not result in charges, but it did result in reporting. Reporting has a way of lingering. Damon's situation unraveled faster than expected. One complaint turned into several once people realized silence no longer protected them. The rotating host strategy collapsed under scrutiny. Donations were reclassified. Equipment rentals became evidence. The backyard network dissolved not with resistance, but with abandonment, participants deleting conversations and denying involvement with the speed of people who had never planned for consequences beyond embarrassment. The pole disappeared first. The lights followed. Houses returned to their original states, fences repaired, neighbors relieved. The physical traces vanished quickly. The digital ones did not. Isolde tried to contact me twice after she moved out. The messages were not apologies. They were updates, framed as if shared experience still granted access. She mentioned interviews that did not go well. She mentioned a friend who stopped returning calls. She mentioned feeling misunderstood by people who had once praised her confidence. I did not respond. My own life recalibrated quietly. Work resumed its normal rhythm once the questions stopped. Friends who had hesitated reached out again, some with concern, some with curiosity. I set boundaries without speeches, declining to rehash details that no longer required interpretation. The story was no longer mine to manage. It existed independently. Weeks later, a notice arrived informing me that Isolde had settled outstanding tax discrepancies related to unreported income. The amount was not devastating, but the record was permanent. It would follow her into future applications, future negotiations, future explanations. It was not punishment. It was consequence. She found temporary work outside her previous field. The shift was immediate and jarring. Experience did not transfer the way confidence once had. She struggled with being unknown again, with not being recognized, with having to explain gaps she could not fully disclose. Reinvention is harder when your past refuses to stay buried. Damon disappeared from my orbit entirely. I heard through someone else that he moved cities, chasing distance instead of resolution. The network that once felt insulated by familiarity proved fragile once accountability entered the room. The final confirmation came months later, through a forwarded article shared quietly, without commentary. It referenced an investigation into unlicensed event operations, naming no individuals, but outlining the pattern clearly enough for anyone involved to recognize it. The piece framed it as a cautionary tale rather than scandal. That framing felt accurate. There was no satisfaction in reading it. Only closure. I moved into a smaller place closer to work. The furniture was minimal. The silence was intentional. I rebuilt routines slowly, choosing predictability over excitement, not because excitement was dangerous, but because it required honesty to be sustainable. Occasionally, I thought about the moment in the backyard, about how brief it was compared to the fallout it triggered, how a few seconds of eye contact dismantled a structure that relied entirely on not being seen. It reminded me that secrecy does not collapse from exposure alone, but from the inability to justify itself once exposed. I never attended another party like that. Not out of aversion, but out of clarity. Performance loses its appeal when you understand its cost. The story did not end with reconciliation or revenge. It ended with documentation, decisions, and the slow redistribution of responsibility to where it belonged. Isolde did not lose everything. She lost the version of her life that depended on denial. I did not win anything. I regained agency. What happened next was not dramatic. It was stable. And after months of noise, stability felt earned.